shut the door.
Well, good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. I'm Deacon Vicki Hanrahan, Assistant to the Bishop for Synodical Life, and we thank you for joining us for this Equipping the Saints webinar this afternoon. As people are starting to get vaccinated and we're moving in a more hopeful direction with things opening up a little bit, we're not quite there yet, but more top of mind, though, will be questions such as, what have we learned about being church together through all of this? What learnings will we take with us going forward? And how will using technology as a means of gathering and engaging in genuine community help us and help others follow the way of Jesus? So today we've invited someone whose life's work involves helping church leaders figure things out like that. We welcome today Dave Daubert, who's author of a recently published book. I don't know if you were able to pick it up yet, though, Becoming a Hybrid Church. We are very grateful to have him with us today. In a moment, Bishop Joy will give you a little more on his background. But some of you may remember Dave from his time in our synod with Kelly Fisher. After having published Seeing with New Eyes, he was with us for an event. So familiar to some of us. As you know, we typically record these webinars for those unable to make it, and especially for our laity who work during the day and want to join in on the information, or for you if you want to revisit anything. The links can be found to the webinar recordings under scsw-elca.org/webinars. As always, during the webinar today, feel free to write your comments down in the chat area. If you have any resources you want to share, but also we'll stop along the way for questions, and feel free to just ask your questions organically during the session. And now I will hand it over to you, Bishop Joy, for a word of prayer and to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Vicki. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really delighted to see you and be with you this afternoon. So my prayer devotion comes today from quite an old book by Henry Nouwen, Bread for the Journey. I looked back and I was gifted this book by a friend in 1997, but today's reading I think is quite appropriate to what we've learned during these pandemic times, but also to perhaps our topic for today. So March 16th, the virtue of flexibility. Trees look strong compared with the wild reeds in the field, but when the storm comes, the trees are uprooted. Whereas the wild reeds, while moved back and forth by the wind, remain rooted and stand up again after the storm has calmed down. Flexibility is a great virtue. When we cling to our own positions and are not willing to let our hearts be moved back and forth a little by the ideas or actions of others, we may easily be broken. Being like wild reeds does not mean being wishy-washy. It means moving a little with the winds of time while remaining solidly anchored in the ground. A humorless, intense, opinionated rigidity about current issues might cause them to break our spirits and make us bitter people. Let's be flexible while being deeply rooted. Let us pray. Gracious God, as we engage today and think about what our future church might look like, what our present church has become, we give thanks, Lord, for the gift of flexibility. Flexibility when our people cry for it, flexibility within us when we're exhausted and wish to be rigid, flexibility when the Holy Spirit has nudged us forward. We thank you, Lord, for bringing us together this day for time of renewal and time of pushing our roots deeper. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So it's my great delight to have Dave Daubert with us. Dave and I met quite a long time ago, and I'm just absolutely delighted to see him again. I know that he is known to many of you as well. He has served in congregational, synodical, and church-wide ministries, continues to serve along with his spouse, who is a deacon in a congregation in Elgin, Illinois. and spends much of his time with Day 8 strategies, consulting with congregations and synod and other partners across our church and ecumenically, thinking about how we are the church, how we can move forward in the fields of church renewal, leadership, stewardship, strategy. He has a great mind and is very concerned about how the mission and ministry of the church can move forward. So please join with me in welcoming Dave Daubert to be with us this day. Thank you, Dave.
Oh, thank you, Joy. Thanks for your kind words. I'm glad to be here, and I've known your bishop for 20 years? I don't know, close to it.
Mm-hmm.
We both were younger when we met anyway. And it was a joy, pardon the pun, when she was elected bishop, because honestly, my heart always leaps every time a mission director for evangelical mission becomes a bishop, because the church is the church in mission. And when we have people who have that rootedness in their work, which I hope all of you in some way do, I know that the Synod is in a position to lean into the future as opposed to lean into the past. And we put our feet solidly on the past. It's important, but we do so a little bit like the starting blocks in a sprint race, not simply to treasure it, but to be the foundation on which we push forward into the next chapter of ministry. So Bishop, I'm so glad you're bishop, and it's good to rekindle this. And I hope that the work you do with these folks is fruitful, and the work that they do with you is fruitful too. I'm going to share my screen and work through some slides. And at the end of this, I will print the slides out in a PDF, 4-slide handout, per page handout, and I'll send that to Vicki also, so that those materials can be given to you for your use. And any way that you can use them is fine with me. I stole most of this material already from other people who are smarter than I am, and I'm just a collector. And I try to remember, I give credit when I can, but by the time I do things, often I forget who I stole it from even. So seriously, just use it in ways that advance the mission of the church, and it will be good stuff. Having said that, I'm going to share my screen and get us started, and I'm going to kind of work through some things here. There's my website. If you want to get in touch with me, you can go there. At the end, I think I'll put my email up too, but you can just go there and hit contact, and there's a thing pops an email up. I'm always glad to talk or interface with you. So if you got a question after this, just shoot me an email. I'm pretty good, as my wife will tell you. She goes to bed at 10:30 to 11, and I stay up until I fall asleep in bed answering emails and working on stuff. And then I wake up at 2 in the morning with my laptop on my chest, glad I didn't drop it on the floor. So I'm pretty good about answering emails. So if you would like a question answered or some interaction, please don't hesitate. I'm always glad to be in interaction with you. What I'd like to start with is this scripture, and it's just one of many. It's a random choice of sorts collected from a non-random list of missional texts. But there are lots of missional texts in the New Testament. There's the Great Commandment, there's the Great Commission, there's Luke 4, John 20, 2 Corinthians 5. There's all kinds of places where the work of the church is articulated. But this is one I like. It says, so when they'd come together, meaning the disciples, and this is the ascension text right before Jesus takes off. They asked him, Lord, is this the time when you'll restore the kingdom to Israel? Notice they're still looking for restoration. They're still thinking, are we going to get our past back? And Jesus replied, it's not for you to know the times or periods the Father has set by his own authority, but you'll receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem and all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And I think what's key here is our longing for the past and restoration, as opposed for the future envisioning, is one of the leaning points for the church. When we lean back rather than lean forward, we lean away from the direction that God works. God's work in the past is a story to tell and an important one, and God's work in the future is an adventure to join and participate in, and an important one as well, as we're on our way to the reign of God. And there's a lot of mystery in it. Jesus said, think about this. The last question the disciples want an answer from, and Jesus says, I can't tell you. I mean, bummer, wrong question. Okay, time for me to go. Your last question will remain unanswered. But he does say, instead of answering your question, I want you to know that you're going to receive the Holy Spirit, you're going to have power, and you'll be my witnesses. And then he talks about the world as they know it, from Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth. And I think this is a critical part of what it means for us to be church, that whether we're online or whether we're on site, whatever that means, physically, incarnationally, digitally, online. The work of the church is empowered by the Holy Spirit, and it bears witness to the grace of God made real for us in Jesus Christ. Having said that, we do this work really in two ways. We do it we're trying to help our folks know the story of Jesus, experience the presence of Christ and the movement of the Holy Spirit in their life, deepen their faith, deepen their commitment as disciples, and learn what it means together to embody the body of Christ. That this kind of work is essential, and any church that doesn't help people dig deeper and strengthen the body eventually runs out of gas if it's working all of its work outward. The flip side is if a church only works inward and is focused mostly in this inward kind of direction, it misses what the calling of the church is, which is to bear witness to who Jesus is, to embody his ministry, and then send out to actually continue his ministry. In other words, to be the feet, hands, and voice of Jesus. And that sentness, which is in all these missional texts, and this interaction with the world. So every congregation has to be very intentional. What are we doing to strengthen the faith and the embodiment and the equipping of the saints, if you will, of our people to be the presence of Christ for each other and for the world? And how are we mobilizing and sending them both in our collective programmatic kinds of things and in our individual as they go out to live their vocation in their families, in their communities, in their occupations, etc. These are all critical. And as you think about doing this, we realize this is pretty complex, and the options for doing both of these are magnified like 1,000,000 times. That once you take something you could do one way or had only embodied one way for so long, you really didn't have imagination for it. And then you had to stop doing it because of the pandemic, and you had to figure out whether to restart it or not during the pandemic using online stuff. And then the pandemic winds down and you've got to come back to on the ground, but you've got this online thing. The matrix of options isn't just two anymore. It's a bunch of hybrid things. It's very complicated. So Richard and I were watching this as we were working with congregations in different ways. And Richard's he's a DEM, and he's one of my clients, if you will, that I've done a lot of work with their synod, renewing churches. And Richard was seeing something and I was seeing something, and I said, I'm going to do this. And I invited him to write this book because he had some great on the ground insights. And I had seen some things, and we thought maybe we could be helpful as congregations start to sort this much more complicated venue out. There's a guy named Tom Rayner. Some of you may know him. He's more in that conservative evangelical realm, I suppose, but pretty smart about church renewal in a number of ways. And he wrote this blog last October, 5 reasons why 2021 should be a new base year for your church. And I really believe that 2021 should be the most creative year in our church's ministry, maybe in our lifetime. 2020 was less creative and more scramble creative in the sense that it was reactionary creative, which isn't bad. We did a lot of creative stuff, and all the great stuff we did is the foundation for this. But last year we didn't do it on purpose ahead of time by thinking, what are we going to do? We got all kind of jolted January through March as this pandemic elevated, and all of a sudden, boom, everything you planned for Easter, even in February, was thrown out the window, and we were all scrambling to put things together. But when we got to 2021, now we actually know there's a pandemic, no surprise. We know the trajectory of the pandemic, and we know the trajectory that's at least semi-forecasted through things like vaccinations and so forth. So we all expect a certain trajectory that at the moment seems at least statistically worth betting on. So this is the chance now, as we're putting things back on the ground, not to put them back, but to put them back differently. And as we're continuing things and not continuing things online, to decide what are we going to continue online because it was actually better online, or we provide some useful thing, and what are we going to stop? So a lot of decision making. But the church of 2022 will be radically reshaped by however we respond and work this year in 2021. So I want to remind you that Easter was often discussed when this started as being canceled. Of course, it wasn't canceled. The resurrection celebration would be done no matter what. And it was an amazing thing because on the ground services were canceled, and because of the urgency, the church did something, because the pandemic started in March, that everybody tried to figure out how to celebrate Easter online. And not everybody succeeded in the same degree, but a lot of people pulled it off in some way or another. And churches everywhere, congregations were online. The amazing thing is, and this is like 120% data-driven reality, we now know without question that because the congregations all canceled their on-the-ground services, not just here, but in Europe and all over the Western world and parts of Asia and Africa as well, and because so many people were online, And because it was such a big deal that it was only a few weeks from when we were thrown into the pandemic that we got to Holy Week, ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox News, public TV, public radio, CNN, it didn't matter who you watched. They were all talking. What's the church going to do? How are we going to deal with Easter? So we had this incredible PR thing happening on the nightly news for the whole week of Easter. And people were curious. And Easter is a time when some people were more attentive anyway. So without question, more people heard the gospel preached last Easter than any other day in the history of the planet. And there's not even a close second. Because if the only way to hear the gospel would have been to show up in a building, only X number of people would come. And we know that literally multitude times more than that were watching and paying attention online. So online was an explosive success. And then we had to sustain it. We also know that if this had happened in July, not every congregation would have been online in August the same way. If this had happened in the summer slump, instead of the urgency of Lent, congregations would have reacted differently. And so some of the gift of timing is that when there's a do or die situation, and we really don't feel like we have a choice, there's only one option and it's a stretch, we're usually willing to stretch. If it's easier to work some other way or there's no pressure to do it, we're usually less willing to stretch. But because of the necessity of this, a lot of us succeeded at getting online and discovered it was possible. And our folks discovered, in many cases, well, not only was it possible, but I would have opposed that, but now I kind of like it. And we have a lady in our church, she's 87 years old. And we brought her in to record. We do all of our online worship's been recorded through the last about 6 months. We started live stream and went to recording for quality issues. And she came in and she said after she did this, Pastor Dave, this online thing is just amazing. And she's got an iPad, and her daughter, who's a grandmother herself, I mean, this is a great grandmother, said, this is amazing. I wish that we'd had this in 2013 when I was having my operations and was in hospital so much. I missed more church that summer than I'd missed in 20 years. And if only we'd had this then, I would have been able to stay so much more connected. And I thought how interesting it is that an 87-year-old woman is saying, if only this had happened a decade sooner, in terms of the technology and the leaping forward. Obviously not the pandemic and the downside, but if only my church had been more progressive and more proactive, I could have had a different experience when I went through that. So a lot of older people, and certainly a lot of baby boomers who were iffy about it, are now much more positive about it. And of course, some people are still quite resistant to it and don't think it's the real thing. Some people are thinking both are fine. Some people are thinking, well, I'm going to stay online. I like the convenience and the way it works. I don't have to spend 3 hours driving to and from church and all that stuff. I can worship and I'm done. Other people are like, no, there's not any real community there and I'm not going to be part of it. If you're not here with real people, it doesn't count. So then we got tension. So it's not as easy anymore. So we've added these dynamics of the pandemic to a changing world, right? The world was already changing, church and society were changing. The COVID pandemic really added an interruption to that, but it was an extended time without physical gathering in a lot of places, and online worship filled the void. And what it really revealed for us is that the system wasn't really broken by the pandemic as much as the fragility of the system was identified. Congregation I'm at, when I came here, it was part-time. I was still working full-time at the ELCA, and I came here part-time because they were in the process of closing. And we've been here 18 years, and we've been in the black now for the last 8 years. And we actually had our best year financially last year during the pandemic. In terms of, we finished about $47,000 in the black, which was way too much actually, but it was what we were able to do sustaining wise. So next year we've got to lean into stuff, and we're changing some things around because you can't have that kind of money accumulating and not be using it. It's just wrong. We're not a bank to collect. But the strength of that is also still pretty tenuous because, I can look at these 3 families who are older or have grandchildren out of state and might want to move or something. And if those 3 things all happen in a 2-year period, I'm going to go from really strong to really in trouble. So even as a sustainable, pretty healthy congregation doing pretty vibrant stuff, I can see if the right 2 or 3 things happen, I can go from a solid situation to a really marginal one pretty quickly. We all know this. The pandemic put all of us on the ropes at the same time, which was bad in many ways because it stressed us, but it was good in that we were all in this together. There's a kind of a unity and a camaraderie in the church that I haven't seen quite the same way. We would never have had an event like this on a regular basis in synods prior to the pandemic, and the kinds of gatherings and collegiality that we've been able to foster because people needed to connect and realized, hey, technology works better than we thought and are open to it. So we can't go back. A lot of people say, oh, I can't wait to go back. Or now maybe you've already started. We're back on the ground worship. Last week at our second service, we started. This week we had both services, 8:15 and 10:45. And I'm doing it interim. So I actually have to drive across the river, and I'm doing a 9:30 service at another congregation here in town that's between pastors and having some problems. So I'm trying to walk them through that as a part-time interim. And I have to remind people that you can't go back. You can only go forward. That if you want to put things back the way they were, in most cases, a typical congregation in the ELCA and the Episcopal Church USA and the PC USA was in decline, and participation was shrinking. Membership was aging. And if we want to go back, say, boy, I can't wait till we go back to normal. That's just really wishing to die slower instead of faster in many cases. So we just have to remind people that the good old days, like 2 years ago, really weren't the dream for the church. They were the base from which we were working and from which we entered the pandemic. But we have to go forward. We have to lean in to whatever God has in store. And part of that means we have to work in whatever our context allows, in both on the ground, physical, incarnational, tangible stuff, and online. And we ignore the online world to our peril in most settings. And part of this is going to mean that both on the ground and online worship have to change. One of the beautiful things, and we're wrestling with this now, we put a new projection system in our sanctuary. We got a laser projector because it showed better images, and we decided if we can't sing, we needed better video because we got to fill with media that we can't provide the same. So we're changing our liturgy a little bit. I mean, the historic structure of the liturgy and Eucharist, we're changing how we're sharing Eucharist right now. We're changing music. We're thinking about interaction. And since we didn't have on the ground worship for a year, do we have to say what we did on March 8th last year is what we do on March 14th this year? We're just going to start where we broke. Or do we say we had a whole year and all of our bad habits and good habits were broken long enough? Why don't we be intentional about putting it back forward rather than putting it back? So the chance for liturgical renewal for on the ground is really before all of us, because most people are thrilled enough to be back on the ground and had enough of a gap that if you don't do anything just totally wacky, most people will be pretty open to the flexibility of it because they haven't practiced anything for a year anyway. If you take some of the things you've learned online about crispness and attentiveness and announcing things differently, which I hope you have, then maybe we need to be more crisp and more attentive and change how we do some things on the ground as well. There's also a real potential for online ministry in a lot of different ways. I think it's not just about worship. Getting on worship was the urgent thing because of Easter, but it's really not the only thing. And I think we have to work really hard to remind people that the word virtual should be eradicated from our vocabulary with regard to online ministry. For some reason, if somebody called somebody on the phone before the pandemic, they would just say, hey, I talked to so-and-so today. They would never say, I almost had a conversation or I had a virtual conversation. On the phone, it was just, I talked to somebody. We've so adjusted to the technology that we don't think of it as a virtual environment when we talk to somebody on the phone. It's just talking to somebody on the phone. That's the medium through which we talk. For some reason, when we add video to that, so I'm not just hearing you, but now I can actually see you. Like you can see my hands moving and my eye expression. We've gone to the word virtual, and virtual means it approximates reality, not quite real. And there are virtual things. There are virtual reality games and things which are creating a fictitious environment which is designed to approximate reality. But the webinar we're having is a real class. The worship that people do is real worship. The interactions they have, the meetings we have, they're not virtual meetings. They're real meetings. They're just taking place online. So I'm really working hard to get people to remove virtual from the places where we're having meaningful interaction, because we're not virtually reacting to each other. We really are. And leave virtual for where it really belongs, which is in the games and lots of places where virtual reality is approximating reality. And be sure that you think of online not as an approximation, but as a real place where we can actually meet and do real work. And that no matter where we are, whether we're physically one place or digitally another place, that we're participating in God's mission. That's really the key. Now, having said that, all those things mean there's tension now in a way that there wasn't. And I've heard some really vicious church fight stories, or coming back from the pandemic, people who didn't believe in masks and thought their pastor was a coward or not faithful and thought they should be in the sanctuary all along. Other places still not in the sanctuary, and not, how do we use data? There's just so many options and so many opinions, and our society is so divided that very often church just approximates society because we really don't use good spiritual discernment, prayerful, scriptural, foundational things. And we don't think ahead to build principles for decision-making. Instead of, we just argue about them until somebody wins or loses. So it's going to be really important, I think, as we put things forward to really think about relationships, paying attention to people, listening, foundational things like a good scriptural basis for why we do what we do, reminding people who we are as God's people, and not to see online as competing with on the ground, but to see online as a place where certain things can happen well, better, and on the ground as a place where certain things can happen well or better. And we should be opting and thinking about both. And in some cases, we might even be interfacing both. If you're live streaming your on the ground worship, then you're interfacing through a live stream, both on the ground and on the internet online. If you're having a meeting, as I'm going to the meeting for council at the church, the other congregation I'm at, about 7 of us will be in one room, masked and socially distanced around a microphone, and there'll be 3 other people online who will be zooming in from a distance. It's going to be a hybrid environment. So that because the president actually lives in Florida, and instead of not being able to participate now with Zoom, they already figured out, hey, the officers can go to be snowbirds and stay connected. So it changes a lot of things about a lot of things. And you just have to be open to, well, what's the best course of action and what are the advantages and assets we have of doing each thing in a certain way. One thing we know, online worship will be normal. A lot of people have adapted to it well. This is going to change some over the next 6 to 24 months as people readjust on site, as they think about online, as congregations decide if they have the capacity to keep a good online experience going and put together on the ground stuff. That's hard. It's extra work. So people have to figure that balance out. But we know that having online worship is normal. And a lot of people will say that if my church stops it, then they've let me down. And whether we're here to consume that or not, you can argue, but it's just a reality. There's an expectation that now that people know we can do this, they want us to do it. It's going to make a huge difference in the winter in states like where you are in Wisconsin when storms hit, because attendance drops to a pittance. But if you have an online worship service, a lot of people will opt out, which means it might even get smaller on the ground. But instead of opting out and doing nothing, they'll opt out and go online. And suddenly attendance that would have been 25% of what it was might be close to 100% of what it was, but distributed quite differently. So for shut-in ministry, for reaching new people, for thinking about weather patterns, snowbirds who go to Florida or Arizona will stay connected with your congregation if you have a strong online presence. In many cases, they'll just go from the on-site to online while they're down there. They won't go look for another congregation, probably at the same rates they were. So they may not be as bi-congregational. Officers and council members and committee members may still be able to Zoom into meetings. All kinds of things are going to change. We don't know how the balance is going to be. But online meetings, teaching, small groups, all this stuff opens so many possibilities. And if we're smart and don't go too fast, because you can get overloaded, but if we're smart and make some adjustments and don't rush to go back on the ground, but to say, what have we been doing online that's worked well, and how can we add an on the ground component to it now? Think the on the ground part is going to happen easier because people are instinctively drawn to their past and what they've experienced. So if you can take advantage of what you've learned and say, how can we take these online groups or this online meeting platform and then synthesize back coming on the ground? So it's not like, okay, council's been meeting for 12 months online. Let's not meet online. We're just going to meet physically. Don't Bible studies have been online. We're going to stop online and go physical. No, think about this kind of dance and what that might mean. Another thing that I think is really important is that when there's a lot of tech contact, which is emails, live streams or record streams or whatever those things are, human contact is really important. And I've found that one of the best, if I could give one tip to everybody that has gotten me the most mileage, is write handwritten thank you notes to people, or greeting notes or congratulation notes. Just pay attention to people. And if you see something online, for example, if you see somebody say in Facebook, I did this amazing thing, or my daughter did this thing, or we went on this thing, don't go to the comments section and write a comment. Refrain. Instead, go to a piece of paper and write the same thing you would have written in the comment section on a note. Say, hey, I saw you had this thing happen. I just wanted to let you know how proud I am, or how happy I am, or how sad I am, or that I'm praying for you, or whatever. And if you can do that, what happens is the online environment becomes a source of things, but you'll just bury yourself in a string of 83 comments from friends. But the person who writes a note puts a stamp on it and says, I saw this and I'm thinking about you, puts it in a whole different thing, because rather than the convenience of a quick, I'm done, somebody took the effort, and now all of a sudden I matter at a whole different level. And so being tech savvy about things, but not always saying, oh, I learned this through tech in a high-tech way, so I should respond in a high-tech way. It might be that a phone call or a thank you or a sympathy note, handwritten, will get way more attention because it shows not that you noticed and wanted to get something in the mix, but that you cared enough to spend extra time. So don't think that hybrid means everything's high tech. It's really being wise enough to know what are the wide range of tools that I have as a pastor or a deacon or a leader in the church in whatever form it takes for you. And how can I use all of those tools in the best way to make sure that I advance God's work and give people the attention that they want and deserve. The other thing is we don't have to do everything ourselves, and I'll talk a little more about that later. This is Kerry Newhoff, another church consultant that I think is an interesting guy. He's a Canadian, and I don't agree with everything Kerry puts out, but I agree with a lot of it, and I learn a lot, and he stretches me. But he said this, if a lot of people use online to get people to come to the building. In other words, Facebook and those things were like the yellow pages. But in the future, pastors will use the building to reach people online. In other words, kind of a mission outpost piece. And that we have to keep reminding ourselves that in a postmodern, less churched culture, the ministry of attraction, as attractive it is for us, is not a methodology that is nearly as important long-term as a method that is a ministry of sending, of going. And it's pretty easy actually to go into the online world. Now, it's also easy to get sucked up there. You can spend hours, you see this and then you attack that thing and you follow the meme and then there's a link to a story. And pretty soon you're looking at something from the awards show that was on Sunday night, and it has nothing to do with where you started. So you can waste a ton of time here. But at the same time, if you're strategic, you can visit a lot of people in a hurry. You don't have to take it long to dial. You can determine the length of the interaction because you're using a text medium on social media, as opposed to getting into a conversation, which might take 20 minutes, but you can interact in 3 or 4. There's no drive time in between. So you can talk to 8, 10, 12 people in an hour potentially online pretty easily, whereas you wouldn't have gotten one visit in with somebody the other way. Somebody else you might need to call. So you should phone them, text them, email, social media them, drive and visit them. This is kind of matrix, but it's always about sending and finding a way to people's lives, not doing something and like bait, trying to get a swarm of animals or bees or something to come to us. And I think this is really an important insight for Kerry Newhoff to share, that we just have to keep thinking. Our building isn't really a destination. It's really a mission outpost. It's a sending point, not a receiving point primarily. Now, here's some things we know, and these are scary. We know that physical gatherings are going to resume, but for the most part, they're going to be smaller. And that's not just a post-pandemic, like they're smaller and gradually people will come back. George Barna did some research. At the moment, 22% of all regular church attenders prior to the pandemic starting last March have not been in a worship service once physically in the last year or online in the last year. So almost a quarter of our people are 100% unchurched in terms of worship life, which means if those people haven't been engaged in church in some other way, small groups or leadership or something, we've probably lost 1 out of every 5 people who attended church are probably now functionally unchurched, de-churched. We also know that as the online world has become a real place, that people are going to attend physically less. And that can make us nervous. It makes me nervous. We have worship. I've got a sanctuary of a certain size. I've got the capacity to move things around and a pretty nimble congregation here after 18 years, so we can make adjustments. But, it feels different to have X number of people when we used to have X plus something. And so do we have to change our worship schedule? Do we have enough in our current system for an 8:15 and 10:45, or do we need to have one service at 9:30? Well, that makes everybody mad, right? It's not early enough for early. It's not late enough for late. So, there's a lot of questions, and we'll have to see. It's too early for me to even know the answer, but I know that that's the kind of thing we got to think about. At the same time, even though less will physically attend, it's possible your overall attendance might increase. I know our summer attendance usually drops. People go to the lake and the cabin and all the things they do on vacation. But I've noticed during the pandemic, especially people who camped and stuff were pretty likely to do that anyway. And in the old model, they would have gone to camp and not been in worship, but they were online. So a lot of people may find that even though your summer attendance physically has that slump, that a lot of the people who wouldn't have been there now are using the online platform. So summer attendance might go up as a result if you're willing to keep the online environment as a viable spot. A big part of all of this is keeping people connected relationally. It's one thing to watch a TV program, and live streaming kind of degenerates the TV if we don't have an engagement strategy. It's quite another thing to engage people and form community. So being proactive about this engagement piece, and whatever way you can do that, we'll give a few tips in a few minutes here, that might be helpful. And to never forget that the incarnation does say that physicality matters, that the presence matter, and that completely online ministry for most of our congregations is not really an option. It's not that completely online ministry might not be a viable and meaningful ministry, but for most of us, some physical reality, some gathering points are what it's going to mean to be a local congregation for the foreseeable future, and maybe until the kingdom comes. In order to do that means we can't just be doing worship. We've got to be thinking about small groups. We got to be thinking about education. We got to think about leadership development. We got to think about evangelism and all the things, and move beyond that kind of platform from Sunday to being a 7-day-a-week church. And hopefully that makes it diverse and accessible, but also hopefully easier. There's things you can do more with less using technology than ever before. And while the learning curve can be scary and the changes can be tension producing, the fruit might be worth it in many of your cases. So having a Facebook page was probably the main online presence people had, maybe a web page, but they weren't very dynamic. Facebook pages didn't get updated much. Web pages were almost yellow pages for most places. Some of you have been exceptions to that for a long time, and that's really good. Anybody who was more advanced in this curve before the pandemic hit was already able to lean in a little better. But it's really important to remember that on-the-ground worship is not designed for online viewing. A lot of people think being in church is boring. It's even worse to watch people who think they're being bored on TV. So if you're not engaging people in an online environment, then it just doesn't work. So we've gone to recorded worship, for example. We just thought live streaming that service for us doesn't work. Doesn't mean you should be doing that, by the way. There are places who are live streaming a physical on-the-ground service, and they've got enough camera movement and they've got enough tech people to make it work. They've got a couple of PTZ cameras and some video mixing, and they're able to do some things to keep it having some dynamism. That means you could live stream well, but you have to have the right equipment and tech stuff. And recording is actually less expensive, but more work. Live streaming is more expensive to get the equipment up and a moderate amount of work, but then you don't have to do it twice and edit. So you got to kind of think about your gifts, your talents, your resources, and what you're trying to accomplish. But it's really important to remember that adequate worship from the inside is often bad TV. And what I mean by that is I've watched every Sunday until I became an interim about a month ago. My wife and I would watch our worship service and participate in that. And then I would look at 2 to 4 other worship services. So I was watching 3 to 5 church services a week. And I didn't watch every minute, but I watched a lot. And I watched transitions, I watched music, I listened to preaching. And it's really clear, for example, a lot of small congregations don't have the musical skills to have enough soloists and people to do a good job. And I've heard some really bad singing online, just some horrific stuff. I've heard some beautiful stuff. But if you're a small church with 50 people, you might only have one person who's actually a TV-worthy soloist if you're lucky. If you got 5,000 in worship or 2,000 in worship or even 300 in worship, the math means that if you had 1 for 50, you might have 6 for 300, and you got a base to work from differently. And a good choir doesn't necessarily make good solos. So the section singing works one way, solo singing sings another. So it's important to take your gifts and match them. And it's better to have less songs if you have less skill, and do either a better job at the smaller amount, or at least do less of it based on the culture of your place, so that you use less of your weakness and more of your strength. Another thing is, how do you move people from just watching like a TV program to connecting? And this is where the chat thing, in any kind of a system, if you're not doing synchronous viewing, whether it's live stream, whether it's actually happening live, or using a recorded with like Facebook Premiere or YouTube has same kind of features, so that you're creating community. And I've talked to people over and over and over. They said, I'm so glad that I can watch at 9:30. It means the world to me, not just that I'm watching worship, but that I know other people are watching with me, that we're doing it together. So you can create community online. And using the online comment section and having it be active and alive is really important for prayers, stories, greetings, and helping people put prayer requests up, interacting. We have a chat host. All these things are really important. So I'll stop on worship in a second, but just remember, liturgy has to adjust. Don't think that because you did everything on the ground that it has to be in the online environment, or vice versa. Boy, preaching is different. I'm sure many of you have discovered that preaching and learning to talk to a camera and make good sense of that, and not get response if you tell a story and there's a sadness to it and you can't tell if anybody's sad, or there's a humor to it, you have no idea if anybody laughed. That the process of this really changes how you think about preaching and interacting. I think it's also true that coming back, we should admit, many of us, myself included, we're a little lax about on the ground liturgy, in that we just use Sundays and seasons, which is not the best resource for contextualizing or for keeping things fresh in terms of prayers and things. And we picked 3 hymns, used the pieces of the thing, and it was very generic in many ways, if we're honest. We did a lot of the same things in many places, too often, too regularly. So it's a real chance for us to really think about liturgical renewal. The online gift means we get to think about all of it again. And the break we had has a real wonderful thing. So I hope you find that to be a blessing, kind of freeing. Wow, we don't have to just do what we did. We have the chance to think about what is it that would be most helpful and most worshipful in the context of the liturgy in our setting. And should we move the confession from the beginning to the middle, or should we move the passing of peace in the middle of the end, or should we not say the creed online, but say it when we're in person, or should we use other creeds? Or, I mean, there's a lot of questions and opportunities for worship renewal. So just be sure that you keep thinking about this and thinking about it. And remember how different both online and on the ground are, and take the context seriously. And then just a reminder to not overdo yourself to the point that you're stretching everything so thin to try and keep up with all the possibilities that you limit your capacity, or your capacity limits you to the point where you burn out or just get cranky. This is hard work, and adjusting is really hard work. So it's really important to measure your capacity, and what's ideal in one setting might be off the table in yours, and vice versa, because of the people you're working with, the skill set you have, the amount of people you have, the amount of money you have, all kinds of things. So don't think comparatively about, well, they're doing that over there, that's the best option, we should try to do that. Maybe that's the case, but maybe they're doing that over there because they have this, this, and this, or they have a person with this gift, or who knows somebody who could do that. We're not all going to come out with a one-size-fits-all piece here, even though there's going to be some overlap. And I really hope that you help each other, because we can help each other. There's a lot of easy things that other places haven't found, and vice versa. I can't tell you how many things we're doing in our congregation because somebody showed me how to do it. And I thought, oh, that wasn't so hard. We could do that. And a lot of times it was out of reach, not because it was capacity, but we just didn't know. So sharing and helping is such an important thing. So here's something I think is really important for worship, for engagement. Number 1, ask questions. I won't show you, but at the end of the sermon where I'm the pastor, we post a question every week. And I ask a question. We used to do this before the pandemic differently. And it's the question I want people to think about as a base for the material I'm preaching on in the sermon. And so if I'm preaching on, last week, I'm using a narrative lectionary. Last week, we used the story of the rich man and Lazarus, and they both die. And Lazarus goes to Abraham's bosom, rich man goes to Hades, and then it's the thing. So I asked a question. My question: can you think of a time when you had an opportunity to be generous and took a pass, and then later regretted it? I just want people to be thinking about their stories. This week, the story is Zacchaeus. Can you think of a time when you were surprised by your generosity in a situation? And so we're taking the opposite end of the kind of stewardship question. But I use questions a lot. And that posts a good question, gives people the space for good answers. But you can use polls. We've added our secretary's job description now includes that she is online on Sunday morning at 9:30. She's a chat host, and it's her job to welcome people as she sees people and people check in. We've taught our people, when you come in, you say good morning. It means that your name went on the screen. We know you're there. It also gives other people permission to say good morning, and it makes them more likely to put their screen there. We're more likely to find out who visitors are. So you can train your members to not just show up, but train them. Please use the comment section. Please say good morning. If you see a person you didn't know, click reply and say good morning. I'm so glad you're here. There can be hospitality practices. You don't have to just be watching TV. And we use story invitation sometimes where we'll say, in light of that, who taught you to be generous, or who's the first person who you remember talking to you about Jesus? And people will say, I remember my mom at bedtime, or my grandmother, or I had a Sunday school teacher who, and you can invite engagement and questions that way. I found it's interesting, about 3/4 of people love the chat section and they think engaging during worship online is great. Some of my other folks say, oh, it's really distracting. I don't know how people could be commenting during the sermon, which they usually don't. They do mostly after. So even people's response to the chat section is a little different. The other thing I want us to be conscious about, as I kind of wind down here, is creating an on-ramp for participation. A key to all of this is that worship is not enough. That if somebody's a Sunday spectator, if you will, they're not really creating an engaged involvement in a community. So you have to find places besides Sunday morning to help people go deeper. And this is really the magic of the online world. It isn't really online worship. It's the ability to create a multitude of options where people can go deeper more easily, and we can do more things more creatively on more areas of ministry with less work if we think creatively, we use online well, and particularly think cooperatively. So remember, there's meeting platforms. Not every committee is going to have to come back to meeting in the building. I hope that most of our teams, frankly, don't. In many cases, particularly for short meeting, we have a short meeting. Well, why would you drive 45 minutes for a short meeting and then drive 45 minutes back if you don't live close to the church? Small groups in education. We've got a young woman named Danny who's been very involved in our congregation. She's got a 4-year-old and she's pregnant with a new child. In the life of our congregation, she had never, ever attended a weekday anything at our church, even though she's there almost every Sunday, and she's our nursery attendant coordinator. And now that we're online, Danny has hardly missed any midweek Bible studies or any of those activities. And the reason was, as a fairly young person, a mother, it's a 30-minute drive from Hampshire where she lives, in Elgin where we are. She comes home from a commute. She works until 5 o'clock. She's got about a 30 to 40-minute drive home from Schaumburg out to where she lives, and a 25 to 30-minute drive back. If she wants to come to church for something, she's supposed to be involved with her family in the evening. She's got a young child, another one on the way. She's got a husband who also has a work, but he also has a disability, a medical issue. So all kinds of issues with family and all those kinds of things. She could never come. Now she's never missed. Now, the worst thing I could do is say, well, thank God we can finally go back to meeting in the church library, and tell Danny that she should never come again unless she's really serious and wants to drive to church. So I've got to now that we know we can do this and they know we can do this, I've got to be thinking a lot of things. I could show you, but we've equipped our rooms with hybrid technology in 2 rooms now. So we've got 2 65-inch TVs that are set up with a Zoom and camera setups and an external speaker microphone that goes to the middle, so people can gather physically or online at the same time. It's not that expensive if you got good internet. We've got an online group that's been working through caregiving, kind of like Stephen's ministry. They've been meeting in a hybrid fashion the same way. And there's just a lot of things that we can begin to do differently. And one of the things I think is really important is interchurch cooperation. It has never been better to do things interchurch, because one of the reasons interchurch things don't work between congregations is people don't go to the congregation that's hosting because it's not theirs. Well, when it's our church, we'll come and 4 people from theirs will come, and when it's at their church, they'll come and 4 people from ours will go there. But once you have online, you've gotten rid of the turf advantage in a sense. Everybody's on home turf, and everybody's probably really comfortable sitting in their own house. They're in their own dining room, in their own pajamas, perhaps, drinking coffee or eating a donut, or in the evening having dessert after supper. So there's incredible opportunities for multi-congregational things like never before. And the importance of small groups can't be overestimated. The ELCA has in general been terrible at cultivating these in our congregations at high rates. But online, even a small congregation, it takes 5 or 6 people to have a small group. If you're a Willow Creek, which is only 10 miles from my church, and you've got 20,000 people a week, if you want to form another small group, you need to find 6 people. If you're a little dinky church and you want to form a small group, you need to find 6 people. Once you got 6 people, it's pretty much a level playing field. Small groups can start anywhere, and there's no advantage to being a big congregation and starting small groups. And we're finding all over the country that people who are starting small groups are doing some really amazing stuff online. And there's a lot of evidence that joining a new small group is easier online than it is in person. First of all, in a Zoom session with 6 people, if everybody types their name, I already know when I'm with new people, I know everybody's name right off the bat. I don't have to worry, what's their name again? I don't have to feel stupid. And I don't have to worry about being in a strange place because actually we're all in a comfortable spot. We're all in our living room or our dining room or wherever it is that we Zoom from home. And there's a lot of evidence that the airplane effect happens in Zoom meetings when people decide to commit. And the airplane effect is, if you've been on a plane and always found out you're a pastor, you know that people will tell a stranger things they wouldn't tell somebody close because they know they're never going to see you again. There's a certain safety in telling somebody that you're not going to. And so something about Zoom allows people to feel a little safer because they're in their own house in many cases. And because of the safety of the environment, they're actually able to share more quickly than if they went into the church library or a circle at somebody's home where they were a visitor to get started. So small group ministry, amazing opportunities. The other thing to remember is many of our congregations in ELCA are small. Median for our church before COVID was 63 in worship. That's probably going to drop, at least for physical, after this. We're aging. We have a certain number of people that can volunteer. And if you have 63 as a maximum pool, you know that you don't get 63 people. And that's just how math works, right? The percentages mean that small places have limited stuff. But cooperation now, and I really want you to think about this. If you're in a town that has multiple congregations around it, are there things we could do together that we couldn't do by ourselves? And the online environment makes it even easier to do that and much more neutral for our people to participate so we can maybe do something radically different. The truth is, the ELCA has 9,000 congregations, and right now we think between 5,000 and 6,000 of them have online worship. They're all on Sunday morning between 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock, pretty much. Time zones move it across, but do people really need, from their living room, 6,000 ELCA options with 2 sermons? Text from the narrative and the revised comment as the bulk of the 2 things. Or would it be better to have cooperative ministry and maybe have less that go better? In Blacksburg, Radford, Virginia, 5 congregations produce 1 worship service online a week. And as they go back underground, they're going to keep doing that. But it's going to be the ministries of present this online worship. This is brought to you through the ministries of boom, 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 boom. And they share the preaching and the children's sermon and the prayers and all those pieces, and they put it together. And instead of all of them having something at a lower level of capacity than they could do by themselves, they've done something a little better, and they have less work, a shared ministry, and they were able to have a good online ministry relative to their skill set and online, but they don't need 5 of them all at the same time, all of the lower quality. So cooperative ministries really open that up. So I really want you to ask this question, because if you're going to do small groups and meetings and online, maybe online worship isn't the place that you want to put the biggest part of your energy. And if you want to stay there, which I'd urge most of you to do, you should think about being cooperative. So I'm going to finish with this little kind of case study, and then we'll have maybe a couple of minutes for questions. This is a made up case study, but it's based on a few real things that have happened, and I put them all in an idealized case. So this is better than anything that I've seen happening yet, but it's not unrealistic. 4 congregations had on the ground services before. They used to do Lenten and Advent services, and they were all bummed that not as many people came on midweek services as used to come. They had a mix of small groups, things like women's circles or choirs or a men's breakfast or whatever those things might be. Only 2 of the 4 congregations had any adult education on Sundays. And actually all 4 of the pastor taught a Bible study during the week. Post-pandemic, what if it looked like this? They still all have an on-site worship, something on the ground. But between the 4, they do 1 online worship service, and their pastors rotate preaching and the like. And so that it's the ministry of, and they share it. The 2 that had adult Sunday school can continue it. But they go online for Advent and Lent, and suddenly attendance, even if it's as bad as it was before, is quadrupled because of the fact that they all do this together. And actually what most places experienced was Lenten attendance this year was better online than it was on the ground last year or 2 years ago, because last year was really a mess anyway. They do 2 of them decided they still wanted physical stuff, so they did lunch with Lenten things over lunch in 2 sites. They do joint services, things like Thanksgiving and church picnics and things to have something bigger. And what's most creative, I think, as an option is instead of having 4 Bible studies during the week, the 4 pastors got together and they decided they'd each teach a class on something all the time, but they would coordinate. So one person would say, I'll do a class on Tuesday night on spiritual practices. And somebody says, I'll do a Wednesday morning class on the preaching text from the lectionary. And somebody on Thursday says, we'll do an online thing on current events in theology or whatever. And so instead of each congregation having one Bible study from their pastor, suddenly these 4 congregations, by cooperating, each pastor isn't doing any more work, they're doing one class a week, is offering a curriculum with different doorways into the kind of learning that you're doing and different times for people in daytime and evening in ways that none of these congregations could put together before. And then they're able to expand small groups. So I really want to urge you to think creatively. Most of our congregations will do better, particularly in developing disciples, if we don't put ourselves as an island and say people are only going to get the capacity that we can give them from our little corner. That if we multiply that by 2 or 3 or 4, depending on how many congregations it makes sense in your area to partner with, a whole host of things can happen. And you can bring in speakers and all kinds of people from outside that you could never do before, because it's cheaper to bring somebody if you don't got to pay plane fares and all the rest. So just use your best. And I'm going to stop here with this phrase. I think Paul's message to us is really important. I'm confident of this, that the one who began a good work among you will bring it to completion by the day of Jesus Christ. You have an incredible set of gifts. That's why you've been called to be leaders. You have an incredible pool of resources. Sometimes we're blind to them. I know I am. I don't always notice all the resources God has given, but God is abundant. And we have an incredible amount of things. And we have more options today to play with than ever before. And that can be stressful, but it can also be enlivening. And the God who is at work in us will bring it to completion by the day of Jesus Christ. Of that, I'm sure. So if you got questions, my email address is just ddaubert, D-D-A-U-B-E-R-T @day8strategies.com. You can see that there. If you want any of these books, including the Becoming, you can go there and type workshop in the coupon code. You get 10% off. If you do bulk stuff, you get 10% off. Put the coupon code on top of the bulk, you get 10% off, 10%. Get them as cheap as you can, because it's more important that you get them. I don't make a living off of books in and of itself. So it's really important. If there's something you need, ask. I'm real thankful to be here. And I'm going to stop my share and give it back to Vicki, Bishop.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dave, for that. We'll open it up for questions at this point. And as you're getting queued up for that, I just wanted to point out too, as you were talking, our diaconia program is a perfect, tangible example of what you're talking about when you get rid of the geographic boundaries to participating in small groups, because our diaconia program has grown because of this. So all of our programming now for diaconia is online. And so when we pivoted, we also worked with our instructors on how to adapt their in-person teaching style to webinars. So if anybody needs help with that, I'm happy to send to you a booklet I wrote on doing that. My first career was in teleconferencing and distance education. So if you'd like a copy of how to adjust your in-person teaching for small groups to teleconferencing, let me know. I'm happy to send that to you. The other thing that I was going to point out too is that not just thinking about following up with written thank you notes, but video thank you notes is also fun to do. Use your Zoom account and record a little message to your members, a thank you, an attaboy, whatever. If you just do short 2 or 3 minute messages, and then you can send that link out to the recording to whoever you want to encourage or whatever. That's also a fun thing to do. And our diaconia teachers have been taught to do that as well for their students. So, I think that the biggest challenge that we have as a community is really thinking outside the geographic boundaries of our congregations and looking at our churches as more than just the members in our congregations. And so small group opportunities, that's why I put the question in the chat room. What can we be doing to be thinking about inviting friends and family of members of our congregations? Because they don't have to be within driving distance any longer. They can benefit from small group and from worship and so forth.
Yeah, I've got people from 9 states that regularly attend our service, Illinois, of course, but Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Maine, Florida. Routinely, mostly through some connection. They're not really just kind of scrolling through and going, wow, that worship is so exciting, I'm going to stop. It's mostly through a connection. Somebody invited them or they found out about it relationally. I want to address one question that issue that Michelle Effers put in, that there is still an imbalance. Not everybody can do the same thing everywhere. And technology is a big deal. It's true in inner cities. It's true in rural areas, that access to technology is still a big deal. And I would urge you to be really advocating. This was the same issue with electricity in the 20s and 30s, and the rural electrification infrastructure stuff made sure that everybody got electricity, even though somebody says, well, there's only 2 farms down there. I don't want to run a whole set of wires just for 2. Well, too bad. It's a justice issue. We're going to figure it out. And so I think this is true for those of you in rural areas. It's going to be slow. I'm in a city of 115,000. I've got 500 megabyte web access in my house. And I got members who are on satellite 10 miles away and their connections stink. So, I mean, because it moves out, I'm on the very edge of a metro area where it goes real quick. So I've got people dropping all the time and people who are doing great. So it doesn't take long to get crappy coverage. And so speak up. If you don't have good coverage in your area, call your state senators and representatives and say, what are we going to do about this? This is wrong. The world is requiring this to survive, and we do it. Churches can advocate for people because education and business, all of them depend on it now. And rural areas always get the short. I mean, I grew up in a town of 1,100 up in the Adirondacks. Rural people always get the short end of the stick when it comes to resources, because it's not worth running a pipe or a wire to your house. Well, you're worth it and your people are worth it. So speak up and get a wire out to your house. There's ways to do this, but it's going to take a few years, and it's not going to happen if people don't say something. Anybody else? Or I know we got, let's see.
Do you mind weighing in about celebrating communion online? There are arguments for never, only in an extreme situation, or sure, people are watching anyway, might as well eat.
Oh, well, if we got time, I wrote a paper on this. I posted it. Theologically, and this is risky stuff, but this is just my opinion. It's not the position of your bishop or anybody else. Theologically, I've gone through it. I think there's a good case for online communion being a valid expression of communion. At the same time, I would say a couple things. One, I've watched a church that said communion, and we're going to make sure you have some bread. And if you don't have wine or juice, just get coffee or something. Anything will be fine. And I find dismissiveness online to be much easier. And so I've seen online communion done poorly, and I've also seen it done without explaining much about it. We take for granted everybody watching knows what it is because we're so bad at teaching. Honestly, we don't really deal with it when we're on site, right? We just assume, so we don't tell people what communion is about and how it works. So I think if you're going to do communion online, 1, elevate it and make it important. 2, teach better than you teach on the ground, and that might mean we need to teach better on the ground too, frankly, in my opinion. 3, in our case, I've only done it twice. We did it for Christmas and we did it for Ash Wednesday. I don't think a weekly communion kind of a piece works for a number of reasons. That's too long to go into. We're going to do it again Monday, Thursday. And in our case, we live stream pieces and record, but we take the live stream down. We do not leave the recording of communion up. If you don't participate in real time, you don't do it, because you don't commune with a TV set, you commune with the community. So in my case, I think online is valid in community, but if you're watching Sunday's communion on Thursday night and you want to chomp on some bread or something, I don't think that that's exactly the same thing. So we actually take our recordings down and pull the edit. And there's a great precedent for that from the Native American community, where I can't remember his name right now, but he said, you'll never see anywhere anybody respectable put up a movie video of any form of like a smudging rite or any of these kinds of things in the Native American community, because it's holy. It's not something to be watched. Either you participate in it or you weren't there. And so I think you can participate online, but I think we have to really elevate. I think that I'm kind of a middle ground on it, and that I think it's valid and important, particularly during the pandemic, but it's about a community eating and gathering around the presence of Christ. It's not about doing words of institution so everybody can have a convenient chance on Tuesday to eat the bread. So I would take it down if it's not done in real time personally. Again, that's me. And I think it's theologically okay. I still think it's awkward. My experience has been people have appreciated it, but have found it awkward too. But new things are always awkward. The fact that it feels awkward doesn't mean it's wrong. Every time I learned something new, I felt awkward before I got good at it. Your bishop's a hockey player. I'm sure the first time she skated backwards, she fell down. You learn new things by being awkward. But so I don't know that my awkwardness is a valid criteria, but I will say it's there.
Well, thank you very much, Dave, for your questions. And Dave did offer his email if you have any questions that are still burning after this webinar. Dave, thanks so much again. I have a few announcements before I hand it over briefly back to the bishop. Please do pay attention to What Matters this week. We will be rolling out a new platform for What Matters using Constant Contact starting April 6th. And going forward, after I leave the office, the issues will be developed by Jason Pooljong. So you want to pay attention to the new email address for submitting articles, and also the new email address to plug into your website for people to subscribe. A lot of you, and I thank you for that partnership, you've included my email address for people to subscribe to What Matters on your websites and in your newsletter. So just make sure that your newsletter editors has the new address for that, and it's in What Matters, so do pay attention to that. For most of you on this call, you will not need to do anything to continue to receive What Matters, as Robin will automatically add you to the distribution. But for anyone that has signed up longer ago than 2 years ago to What Matters, a separate communication will be going out this week, as they will need to resubscribe. Also, the Office of the Bishop is thinking about using Constant Contact more for communications. So you will want to stay subscribed to What Matters for the time being, so that you don't, opt out of other communications that'll come from our office. But we're working on those things, and we'll tell you more about that in the future. Hopefully, my second announcement is hopefully you paid attention in What Matters that the Synod Council has decided we will not be holding a Synod Assembly in May. They revisited that, and they've decided for the time being, we will not hold an assembly in May. There may be a possibility of holding one in the fall, but for now, please just let your voting members know that there will not be a Synod Assembly in May. And we'll keep you posted on those updates as decisions are made. And then finally, a reminder that we've changed our schedule for the Equipping the Saints webinars. Instead of every other week, they will be the first and third Tuesdays of the month. So the next one will be on April 6th. Bishop, any final comments?
No, thank you, Vicki. You covered, I think, the announcements for today, and I realize we're getting quite a bit over time, so don't want to get us on too long. But a special thank you to Dave for all of your wonderful insights and helping us think through all of this. So thank you to you for joining us today. Your wisdom and insights are much appreciated. So thank you for all being here, and I look forward to seeing you again real soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.